They called it a house of gold, a palace so vast and lavish that for generations Romans whispered that nothing in the city would ever be the same. Imagine a vaulted hall whose ceilings glittered with thin sheets of beaten gold, frescoes so bright the light seemed to move, rooms that opened onto artificial lakes and gardens where water ran in engineered cascades. Now imagine the same place at night, lit by torches, crowded with the powerful and the intimate. Rumor says the emperor himself presided over spectacles that blurred power, pleasure, and politics. The question at the center of that rumor, the promise behind this investigation, is simple and sharp. What really happened inside Nero's Golden House, and why would Rome later act as if the palace and its reputations must be hidden from memory? The Golden House, the Domus Aurea, is both a physical ruin under Rome's soil and a narrative ruin layered into the Roman imagination. The palace's stones and frescoes survive in fragments. The stories about its decadence survive only in the pages of enemies and moralizers. To untangle the truth, we must walk a tightrope between two sets of evidence that do not always agree: the material record, rooms, waterworks, decoration, and the literary record, accusations by authors who wrote after Nero's death and who often had reasons to condemn him. The headline version, that Nero hosted orgies so obscene the Senate tried to erase them, is everywhere. But the historian's job is to ask which parts are archaeology, which are accusation, and which are propaganda. If this kind of myth-busting history interests you, hit subscribe and stay with us. We're only getting started. To understand the Golden House, we have to begin with ashes. In July of 64 CE, a conflagration ripped through Rome, destroying swaths in the city. Contemporary accounts differ on origin and intent. Some accuse Nero of setting the fire, an allegation that many modern historians treat as unlikely, but that nonetheless helped shape the emperor's later reputation. What is certain is that the blaze left a central swath of land, slopes and private houses, shops and shrines, available for a new use. In the years after the fire, Nero embarked on an ambitious building program that included an enormous artificial lake, a new palace complex that stretched from the Palatine to the Esquiline, and a reimagining of urban space that emphasized imperial largesse and personal image. The Domus Aurea was not merely a house, it was architecture deployed as statement, a palace that rewrote the city's axis, swallowed neighborhoods, and created an experience of the emperor's presence. Contemporary sources and later antiquarian writers describe it as a gilded labyrinth with banquet halls, pavilions, and colonnaded terraces.
Archaeology confirms a scale and an ambition that were unprecedented. Rooms cut into tufa and concrete, elaborate vaulting, the use of light and water to produce theatrical effects, frescoes and stucco decoration in a style that would later influence Renaissance artists when the buried rooms were first rediscovered. The Domus Aurea could stage events. Spaces are large enough for banquets, for audiences, for processions. Some rooms open onto gardens and water features. Yet the existence of sumptuous architecture and theatrical design is not the same as evidence for the lurid scenarios found in the ancient narrative record. Those narratives are the source of our most persistent images. Two names dominate: Tacitus and Suetonius. Tacitus, writing the Annals in the early 2nd century, provides an account of Nero's reign that mixes administrative detail with moral judgment. He is a senator's sympathetic voice, concerned with the dangers of autocracy and the erosion of senatorial authority. Suetonius, who wrote in the early 2nd century as well, compiled the lives of the Caesars with a taste for anecdote and scandal, cataloging the emperor's virtues and vices in a way that reads, for modern ears, like a compendium of court gossip sanitized by moral outrage. Cassius Dio, a senator writing in the 3rd century, adds another layer: a Greek-speaking aristocrat whose history of Rome is shaped by a later imperial vantage point and whose account draws on earlier, often hostile traditions. What do these authors tell us about the Domus Aurea and the alleged orgies? Tacitus reports that Nero increased his own splendor and diverted public space into his private sphere, using extravagant attainments to showcase his power. Suetonius, more bluntly, records claims that Nero turned his palace into a place of extravagance and depravity, and that the emperor staged banquets that shocked respectable opinion. Cassius Dio recounts episodes that emphasize spectacle, excess, and the emperor's indulgence in sensual pleasures. Taken together, these accounts paint a striking picture: a ruler who used architecture and performance to create a world tailored to his desires, and who allegedly used that world for sexualized entertainments. But every one of these passages comes with a set of warning labels. Tacitus was writing after the fall of the Flavian dynasty, and his sources included senatorial records and oral traditions shaped by political laws. He is not a neutral observer. Suetonius, though later and not a senator, wrote a genre that relished scandal. His work is as much gossip as it is history. Cassius Dio, writing 2 centuries after Nero, relies on sources we can no longer check, and on narratives that had already ossified around certain convenient tropes about imperial misrule. All three lived in social worlds where the Senate and the elite had reasons to define virtue against the extravagant behavior of emperors who flouted aristocratic norms.
A banquet hall can host a carefully orchestrated evening of music and food, or it can host sexualized displays. The stones alone do not tell us which occurred on any given night. Moreover, the archaeological record is incomplete. Much of the palace was stripped or repurposed by later emperors who wanted to erase the physical traces of Nero's presence. Vespasian and his successors filled in parts of the late, built bath complexes over sections of the site, and deliberately superimposed new constructions that erased the earlier landscape. Later generations quarried the Domus Aurea from marble and decorative materials. Even when Renaissance explorers rediscovered subterranean rooms, much had been lost or altered. Where textual testimony is salacious and selective, material testimony is fragmentary and mute about motives. This tension between a material stage clearly designed for spectacular display and a textual chorus of condemnation that insists spectacle equaled moral collapse is the heart of the problem. How do we decide which is closer to what really happened? One method is triangulation, weighing the likelihood of claims against archaeological plausibility, considering the biases of the witnesses, and comparing patterns across similar cases in Roman political culture. It is here that another story from a later century offers a revealing pattern. Look forward 2 centuries to the reign of Elagabalus, emperor in the 3rd century, and you find the same rhetorical machinery at work. Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta, both hostile witnesses, depict Elagabalus through a hypersexualized and orientalizing lens. Claims of bizarre feasts, sexual excess, gender transgression, and religious perversion saturate their portraits. Modern scholars have shown that many of these accusations are suffused with cultural anxieties about the East, foreign cults, and a young emperor's non-traditional comportment. They are rhetorical devices aimed at delegitimizing a ruler who deviated from elite Roman norms. The Elagabalus case therefore serves as a comparative lens. It shows how eroticized rumor and orientalizing tropes are repeatedly marshaled to condemn emperors who threaten cultural boundaries. Bringing that pattern back to Nero does not mean simply swapping one scandal for another. Nero's context is distinct: the early imperial age, the aftermath of a city-consuming fire, a prince with artistic ambitions. But the mechanism feels familiar. The same social actors who had access to narrative authority, senators, chroniclers, moralists, often use sexual scandal as shorthand for political condemnation. When the powerful want to delegitimize an adversary, they weaponize what the public fears and despises. In a Roman aristocratic culture, accusations of sexual debauchery and gendered softening were effective rhetorical weapons.
So far we have outlined the stakes: a burned city, a palace of unprecedented spectacle, textual accusations from hostile writers, and archaeological remains that demonstrate architectural capacity but not specific acts. We have also introduced the comparative pattern that will be important for our reconstruction. Elites repeatedly sexualize and orientalize emperors to delegitimize them. The next question is operational. How do we read the ancient testimonies about Nero in light of the material remains and this comparative pattern? Which claims are plausible because they match the palace's capabilities and the emperor's known predilections, and which are suspiciously shaped by rhetorical motives and later moralizing agendas? Answering that requires patience and careful parsing. For example, ancient authors claim that Nero staged banquets of such scale and theatricality that they consumed public resources and mocked traditional pomp. That specific claim is plausible in the aggregate. The architecture supports the ability to host lavish events and other historical acts. Nero's public performances as an actor or musician, his building program that centralized his image, corroborate a penchant for spectacle. Yet other allegations are more problematic. Some sources imply that the emperor habitually used the palace for sexual spectacles involving indefinite numbers of guests and participants, or that he normalized behaviors designed to humiliate traditional aristocratic norms. These claims are harder to substantiate. They often arise in rhetorical contexts that benefit from portraying Nero as morally corrupt. Where we have only hostile testimony and no corroborating material or neutral witness, the safer language is alleged or reported by hostile sources. There are also practical constraints worth noting. Many of the wildest stories in the later narratives stumble against logistics.
An orgy in the modern sensational sense, a chaotic free-for-all involving large numbers of anonymous partners, may make a good rhetorical punchline, but the spatial arrangement of Roman banquets, with couches and servants and the ceremonial ordering of guests, suggests something more organized and hierarchical. A banquet was as much a ritual of status as it was a site of pleasure. It reinforced networks of patronage. If sexual behavior occurred at imperial banquets, it would have done so within a performative and controlled framework, not as random crowd access. Archaeology can show the stage, social context helps reconstruct the choreography. At the same time, rumor thrives precisely in the gaps archaeological silence leaves. When enemies want to settle scores, they exploit the opacity of the palatial interior and the glamour of its decoration. To accuse Nero of inviting the city's elite into spaces that dissolved public and private boundaries is to allege a kind of political theft. The emperor turned what belonged to Rome into a personal playground.
From the senatorial perspective, the moral horror is not simply sex, but the seizure of civic space. That conflation between sexual deviance and political usurpation is what gives these accusations rhetorical power. We are now approaching a critical pivot. Having laid out the physical evidence and the literary allegations, and having flagged the comparative pattern with Elagabalus, we must decide how to balance probability, motive, and logistics. But before we attempt a full synthesis, there is another layer to consider: the politics of memory. After Nero's death in 68 CE, the city did not simply forget the Golden House. Subsequent emperors deliberately re-engineered that space. Vespasian, and later Titus and Domitian, reshaped the area, drained the lake, and constructed public buildings over the old site. These acts were not simply urban planning, they were political statements. Reclaiming the land for public use was a way to symbolically rectify the perceived excesses of Nero. It was also a method of erasure. By covering the Domus Aurea with new imperial architecture, later regimes could assert their own legitimacy and bury the previous ruler's narrative. This process of architectural overriding and rhetorical condemnation is part of the reason why Nero's image is so transformed in our sources. The physical act of destroying or repurposing the Golden House served as an outward sign of moral correction, and the literary act of denouncing Nero did the same in narrative space. Together, they created a memory in which the palace is not only a site of possible excess, but a symbol of a republic betrayed by its most theatrical son. Historicity becomes entangled with commemoration. The story told about the Golden House is as much about later regimes asserting virtue as it is about anything that may have actually occurred within the palace walls. All of this sets up the central methodological dilemma. Are we reconstructing events or reconstructing reputation? Both projects are valuable, but they require different evidentiary standards. If we aim to reconstruct events, what parties actually took place, who participated, what transgressions were real, we must weigh the mechanics of architecture, logistics, and the contemporaneous testimony that may have had closer access to events. If we aim to reconstruct reputation, how and why the Golden House became a symbol of vice, we must attend to the motives of the chroniclers, the political needs of the successors, and the cultural anxieties that made certain charges stick. As we move toward that dual exercise, a few specific questions demand careful attention. First, which claims about Nero rest on single, late, or deeply hostile sources? Those must be flagged as conjectural. Second, which elements of the text are corroborated, even partially, by material remains or by otherwise neutral administrative records? Those are more secure. Third, which features of the narrative seem to be rhetorical tropes reused in the denunciations of other emperors like Elagabalus, and therefore suspect as inventions of moralizing genres? To begin answering these, let us look more closely at a handful of emblematic allegations and test them against what we know archaeologically and contextually. One recurring narrative detail is that Nero hosted feasts where boundaries between private and public were dissolved. Senators and their families were expected to attend, and the imperial household's displays of wealth were meant to overwhelm civic pride. That depiction fits with both the architectural capacities of the Domus Aurea, large triclinia and expansive terraces suitable for hosting, and with Nero's documented tastes as a performer and patron of the arts. Nero's public performances as a singer and actor, which infuriated elites who believed such behavior beneath the dignity of an emperor, corroborate the idea that he enjoyed theatricalized self-presentation. From this point of view, it is plausible that his banquets were more spectacular and perhaps more unorthodox than those of traditional aristocratic hosts.
Contrast that with tales of routine, institutionally sanctioned orgies that turned the palace into a permanent site of sexual license. These claims often rest on anecdotes reported by authors with moral agendas, and they are seldom supported by independent material evidence. Where the texts lay heavy on lurid detail, archaeology remains silent. The result is a plausible but contested reading. Nero used his palace to stage extravagant entertainments and to perform himself, but the specific sexually charged narratives should be treated as allegations shaped by hostile voices and rhetorical norms. Another emblematic claim concerns the use of the artificial lake and waterworks for extravagant spectacles. Some stories suggest the emperor held mock naval displays or flooded halls for theatrical effect. Archaeology confirms the construction of an artificial lake and sophisticated water installations. The later erection of the Flavian amphitheater on the site of the drained lake suggests that the area was indeed suitable for large-scale public spectacles. The idea of staging water-based entertainments is therefore plausible in functional terms. Whether such displays were consistently sexualized is another matter. Theatricality does not necessarily imply sexual scandal, but it does imply a deliberate blurring of performance and imperial presence that could easily be reinterpreted as debauchery by hostile commentators. A further set of allegations concerns the composition of the emperor's inner circle and the role of notorious figures such as Tigellinus, a prefect of the Praetorian Guard often associated in the texts with enabling Nero's excesses. Here again, the sources are useful but problematic.
Tacitus paints Tigellinus as a sycophant and an enabler. Suetonius repeats similar characterizations. That Tigellinus was a real figure with influence over the imperial household is not in doubt. What is less certain is whether his influence was primarily about sexual license or about the broader militarization and politicization of the imperial guard and court. The tendency to cast an individual as a moral corrupter is a familiar rhetorical move in ancient historiography. It creates a personified villain who can stand in for systemic problems. Having parsed these emblematic cases, we circle back to the comparative case of Elagabalus. The patterns are instructive. In the 3rd century narratives, accusations of sexual deviance and foreign religious practices converge to create a portrait of a ruler who violates Roman norms in multiple dimensions. That same convergence appears in the way Nero is depicted. Aesthetic excess, public performance, and perceived gender transgressions are woven together into a single fabric of condemnation. Comparative analysis therefore strengthens the hypothesis that some of the most sensational claims about Nero might be shaped less by empirical observation and more by a rhetorical logic that equates cultural transgression with political illegitimacy. This is not to say that all accusations are merely rhetorical. Political power did create opportunities for real transgressions. Emperors could and did transform private pleasure into public spectacle. They could flout senatorial prerogatives and assert themselves in ways that alienated elites. The hard point is that the most extreme sexual narratives, the ones that have made their way into popular imagination as historical fact, are often those most vulnerable to interpretive inflation. To move from plausible spectacle to scandal requires a chain of inferences that often rests on hostile testimony, rhetorical tropes, and the absence of contrary evidence. We have now constructed the scaffolding of our argument: an extraordinary palace built after a catastrophic fire, architectural evidence that supports grand entertainments, a set of hostile literary sources that interpret spectacle as moral collapse, and a comparative pattern showing how sexualized denigration functions as a tool of political delegitimacy. What remains is the hard work of synthesis, to weigh each claim, weigh the motives of the witnesses, and propose a nuanced reconstruction of what probably happened, one that resists the impulse to repeat lurid accusations as fact, yet does not whitewash the emperor's use of power and performance. But before offering a reconstruction, we must confront one more complicating factor: the genre of Roman moral history itself. When Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dio write, they are not neutral reporters building a dry dossier. They are authors composing moral dramas. Their audiences expected vivid portraits of vice and virtue. Their rhetorical aim was often to extract lessons about the dangers of autocracy and the loss of civic restraint. The result is an inherently selective record. Stories that illuminate moral decline, especially stories that can be framed as cautionary tales about the abuse of power, are more likely to be preserved and retold. Anecdotes that exculpate an emperor or that complicate a neat narrative of decline are more likely to be omitted or suppressed. Understanding that literary dynamic helps explain why certain claims about the Golden House became dominant. The image of a gilded palace as a den of depravity is a potent moral image. It condenses anxieties about spectacle, wealth, gender, and the destruction of traditional norms into a single memorable trope.
Rewriting the urban fabric by burying Nero's palace and covering the lake with a public amphitheater is the physical counterpart. Replace private spectacle with public utility, and you replace the story of personal excess with a corrective civic narrative. So where does this leave us? We have traced the archaeology and the allegations, isolated patterns of rhetorical vilification, and underscored the political uses of scandal. We have interrogated emblematic claims and shown where plausibility meets suspicion. Yet many specific questions remain undefined. The precise nature of private entertainments, the identities of participants in particular events, and the daily social atmosphere inside the Domus Aurea are all to differing degrees obscured. The palace's stones can suggest what was possible. The texts show us what was said. Neither can claim full ownership of the truth. We stand at a point of tension. The stones tell of theatricality and possibility. The texts thunder with accusation. The city's later acts of overriding show deliberate attempts to redirect memory. Reconciling those strands will require a careful claim-by-claim analysis, weighing source provenance, archaeological plausibility, and the rhetorical patterns that shaped Roman moral discourse. Only then can we move toward a reconstruction that is neither sensationalist or timid, a reconstruction that acknowledges the emperor's taste for spectacle and the likely excesses of image-making, while refusing to grant hostile anecdotes the status of documentary proof. There is one final angle we must introduce before moving into that detailed claim-by-claim work: the social logic of rumor itself. Rumor in ancient Rome did not flow in a vacuum. It moved along networks: patron-client ties, freedmen in the palace, urban rumor mills where market talk and elite gossip intersected. For the senatorial class, slander was a resource. Weaponize a story, and you can delegitimize an emperor whose behavior threatens your status. For the populace, rumor about the elite's private life could be a way of processing indignation or curiosity.
The combination of palace opacity, rooms sealed from public view, and public fascination with imperial personality nourished the rumor economy that produced the most colorful charges. In short, rumor is itself a political actor. It produces effects regardless of the empirical truth of its content. All of these considerations, architecture, textual bias, comparative patterns, memory politics, and the economy of rumor, complicate any simple answer to the title's question. What we can say with confidence at this stage is modest but important. Nero transformed urban space in ways that facilitated spectacular entertainments. Ancient authors report sexualized banquets and moral transgressions, but they also had political reasons to cast the emperor as morally corrupt. Archaeology confirms capacity but not content, and the cultural pattern of sexualized denunciation offers a lens through which many of the most sensational claims should be read skeptically. From this point, the inquiry must split into specific threads: a close reading of the principal textual passages and their sources, a forensic look at the Domus Aurea's rooms and installations, matching textual claims to architectural plausibility, an analysis of the social networks that produced rumor, focusing on actors like Tigellinus and the Praetorian cohort, and a comparative chapter that unpacks the Elagabalus parallel with explicit attention to orientalizing tropes and 3rd century historiography. Each thread will bring us closer to a balanced reconstruction, one that can answer not only what might have occurred in the Golden House, but also why Rome insisted on remembering it in a particular, damning way. Where we pause now is at the threshold of that forensic work. We have set the stage: fire and palace, hostile chroniclers and fragmentary stones, political motives and the machinery of rumor. The next step is to interrogate the principal accusations one by one, to test them against the architecture, to evaluate the provenance and intent of the sources, and to map the social channels by which scandal traveled. Only by doing that detailed, sometimes tedious, often revelatory work can we move from plausible narrative to the kind of nuanced history that both honors the complexity of evidence and resists the temptation of sensational certainties. Before we go deeper into that claim-by-claim analysis, consider this. The Domus Aurea sits in our modern imagination at the intersection of fact and fiction. It is a ruin and a rumor, a space that the city deliberately covered and a story that the city repeatedly told. The historian's task is not to demolish the story or to restore it uncritically, but to ask, relentlessly and precisely, which parts of the tale belong to the palace's stones and which belong to Rome's storytelling.
With that question as our compass, we are ready to examine the primary texts in close detail, room by room, allegation by allegation, and to evaluate the probability of each sensational claim in light of what the stones and the social context can reasonably support. We now move from the scaffolding to the evidence itself, the passages, the rooms, the people,
and put each charge to the test. Begin with the texts, because they are the source of the sensational images that keep resurfacing. Suetonius's colorful lists of vice, written in the early 2nd century, Tacitus's annals, composed with a senator's unease about autocrats, and Cassius Dio's 3rd century synthesis that amplifies earlier traditions. Read literally, these authors give us an emperor who turned a city into theater and a palace into a backdrop for sexualized spectacle. Read critically, and the same passages reveal rhetorical aims as much as reportage. Take Tacitus. His concern is not simply to catalog Nero's calendar of pleasures, it is to show how imperial performativity erodes civic authority. When he writes that Nero increased his own splendor at public cost, the sentence functions as both fact and moral judgment. Spectacle is here a symptom of political dislocation. Suetonius, by contrast, organizes his life of Nero around types of excess, a collection of anecdotes meant to entertain and to instruct a Roman readership predisposed to moralizing gossip. Cassius Dio, much later, compiles and amplifies. All three draw on the same pool of hostile testimony, aristocratic informants, public rumor, and the kind of oral tradition that prefers a tidy moral fable to nuance. The methodological obligation, then, is clear. Every juicy anecdote must be probed for provenance and plausibility. Which of these anecdotes survive independent corroboration? The answer is a few, and only in a limited way. The building campaign is undeniable. The reality of public performance, Nero singing on stage, parading in Greek costume, is attested in multiple sources and matches the emperor's known self-fashioning. That makes the broader claim believable that Nero staged banquets designed as performances, where food, music, and imperial persona merged. Where the evidentiary ground becomes shakier is in the specific sexualized tableaus these authors describe. Wild stories that read like moral parables, accounts of routine, institutionally endorsed orgies with anonymous throngs, rely largely on the rhetorical energy of the chroniclers, not on corroborating administrative records or material traces. So we move from texts to rooms. The Domus Aurea gives us a grammar of possibility. Architects and archaeologists point to a suite of spaces that encourage spectacle, expansive triclinia for formal dining, long porticos opening to gardens and water, vaulted chambers whose acoustics would have amplified music and spoken performance.
The octagonal room, a centerpiece often invoked in reconstructions, is an architectural feat, a domed, geometrically complex space that manipulates light and perspective. Gilding, fresco, stucco, and carefully arranged vistas would have staged experience in almost cinematic ways. Water features and channels, the technical infrastructure for glinting pools and small fountains, are documented and consistent with the idea of theatrical effects. Crucially, these are capacities, not scripts. A room built to impress can host a philosophical symposium, a formal senatorial dinner, a musical recital, or an event that transgresses social norms. The material remains tell us that imperial dinner parties could be spectacular. They do not tell us whether spectacle always tipped into sexual excess. Where ancient authors collapse that distinction, archaeology asks us to hold it open. Practical logistics further constrain the most lurid claims. Roman banquet ritual flowed along a choreography that regulated proximity, service, and behavior. Couches arranged in fixed orders, categories of guest, a dense retinue of attendants whose presence both enabled pleasure and controlled it. A modern image of an orgy, a chaotic mass of anonymous participants, does not jibe with how elite Roman feasting normally functioned. If sexual activity occurred around imperial banquets, it likely did so within strictly hierarchical frames. Performances staged to demonstrate imperial power, patronage, or humiliation. The rhetoric that insists on anonymous excess sacrifices that nuance for a politically efficacious image. Excess equals moral failure equals illegitimacy. Consider the recurring accusation that the Domus Aurea served as a place where private and public merged to obscene effect. This charge does have a political logic. To claim that the emperor converted civic land, whole neighborhoods, into a private playground is to attack him on two fronts. First, for stealing urban commons. Second, for converting communal life into the theater of one man's desires. Successor regimes exploited this reading. Vespasian drained the lake and overlaid Nero's palatial presence with public amenities, a physical and symbolic reclaiming of the city. The architectural of erasure and the architectural of spectacle perform a rhetorical reversal. Cover the palace, correct the memory. We should also test a handful of emblematic details against both source provenance and material plausibility.
The mock naval displays allegedly staged on the artificial lake are feasible in principle. The lake existed, boats could have been organized, and spectacles performed. Whether those events carried a sexualized element beyond the ordinary theatricality of Roman entertainments is indeterminate. The story that mechanical devices or revolving dining platforms facilitated lurid scenes is even more suspect.
Mechanisms of the sort that make good legend are largely unsupported in the archaeological record for Nero's time. Some later emperors received similar attributions in gossipary histories, which suggests a transfer of legendary tech to an earlier notorious court. Then there are the actors who appear in the textual drama. Tigellinus, the Praetorian prefect, often cast as Nero's licentious accomplice; Poppaea, the emperor's wife, who features in both sympathetic and hostile frames; palace freedmen, whose proximity to power made them convenient scapegoats. These figures are real, and their political roles mattered, but the leap from real agency to moral caricature is a frequent move in ancient historiography. Tacitus and Suetonius often supply a villain, an instrument through which wider social decay is personalized. That is useful for narrative, but less useful for reconstructing day-to-day reality. When a chronicler names Tigellinus as the engine of corruption, the historian must ask whether that portrait reflects the officer's actual policy, a senator's anxieties about Praetorian power, or a rhetorical device meant to simplify systemic grievances. To sharpen that point, we return to the Elagabalus parallel. Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta paint Elagabalus in terms remarkably similar to those used for Nero: excess, gender nonconformity, oriental religious perversion. Modern historians now recognize that 3rd-century sources often deployed Orientalist and moralizing tropes to condemn rulers associated with Eastern cults and practices. The pattern is thus revealing. Sexualized and foreignized narratives are an established instrument of delegitimation. Applying that pattern to Nero does not mean erasing his agency. It means reading his vilification as a kind of genre with rules. The rules favor dramatic, memorable scenes of vice. They reward a clear moral. They do not always serve pulverized documentary truth. We must therefore propose a balanced reconstruction, not a single story that eliminates nuance, but a probabilistic account that sorts the more likely from the more dubious. On balance, the reconstruction looks like this. Nero was an emperor with theatrical ambitions, who used architecture and spectacle to cultivate image. He staged lavish banquets and public performances. He used the Domus Aurea as an immersive set piece. He surrounded himself with courtiers, freedmen, and Praetorian officers who enhanced his capacity to stage such events. Those facts are well supported by convergence between text and material evidence. On the other hand, the specific inventory of sexual excesses, routine orgies of the sensational kind, institutionalized erotic pageantry with anonymous throngs, a palace transformed into perpetual bacchanalia, is far less secure. Many of these charges rest on hostile authors, whose motives included senatorial revenge, genre conventions that amplified vice, and a rumor economy eager for memorable scandal. Where the sources are solitary, late, or overtly moralizing, the historian's verdict must be cautious and the language conditional, alleged, reported by hostile sources, indefinitive. There are, moreover, reasons to see the sexual charges as politically potent rather than purely documentary. Sexual scandal is rhetorically efficient. It crystallizes gendered anxieties, condenses critiques of luxury into vivid images, and makes moral condemnation shareable. For elite accusers, it offered a shorthand. Call an emperor sexually deviant, and you imply that he is politically illegitimate. That choice of weapon is not accidental. It maps onto social fault lines. The aristocracy's fear of social leveling, their resentment of imperial self-display, and their need to recover moral and civic authority after the trauma of the fire and the loss of urban space. What then did Rome try to hide? The erasure takes two forms. Physically, the palace was literally covered, drained, overbuilt, and quarried. Politically, the palace's memory was reinterpreted. The story of civic renewal replaced the story of imperial extravagance. To say the city hid the Golden House is to say that later regimes preferred a civic narrative that reclaimed stolen land and denounced the previous ruler's excess. But hiding also worked through slogans and images. The repeated trope of Nero's depravity was useful to his successors because it provided a moral origin story for civic repair. Our final judgment must therefore be twofold. First, that the Domus Aurea was a stage for spectacle, a palace built to impress and to concentrate the emperor's image.
Second, that the lurid catalogs of sexual debauchery are best handled as partisan portrayals, shaped by political motive and rhetorical convention. The most plausible middle path admits both realities. Theatricality and performance under Nero produced occasions that could be read as scandalous. Hostile contemporary and later authors amplified or stylized those occasions into vivid charges of sexual immorality in service of political condemnation. This balanced conclusion carries a larger lesson for how we read political scandal in antiquity, and perhaps about scandal anywhere. Material remains can demonstrate what was possible. Texts tell us what people wanted others to believe. Between possibility and belief lies the machinery of rumor, the rehearsal of moral genres, and the choices of successors who seek to rewrite urban and narrative space. The Domus Aurea is thus a paradigm for how power is performed, remembered, and reinterpreted. It is an architectural emblem and a rhetorical instrument. It is both stage and story. If there is an unsettling aftertaste to this resolution, it lies in the recognition that some of history's most potent images are more about later needs than about the events they purport to describe.
The image of Nero presiding over endless orgies is a useful moral fable. The image of a gilded palace swallowed by public space is a tangible urban fact. Distinguishing between the two is the historian's job, and the work is rarely neat. So what should the attentive viewer carry away? First, read the sources with an eye toward motive. Second, let the stones indicate capacity, but not script. Third, recognize patterns across time, as with Elagabalus, that show how sexualized narrative functions as political weapon. Finally, when a story is angry enough, pretty enough, and rhetorically satisfying, be suspicious. It may tell us more about the storytellers than about the alleged acts. One final question, and it is the one that brings us full circle to the title. If Rome cultivated the legend of the Golden House in order to bury its memory, what other famous outrages have we accepted because they satisfied a political appetite? The answer is not only an invitation to re-examine Nero, but to look skeptically at the scandal economy that shapes reputations across history. If you want to follow that thread, to see similar case studies and the sources that sustain them, check the description for our bibliography and playlist on imperial scandal. And if this myth-busting journey interested you, watch our next deep dive where we unpack the Elagabalus case in full.